Hey everybody, ignore the dogs playing in the background as you can hear them, I'm sure. I apologize for that. Um, so unfortunately, they don't understand that I am doing lectures and they should be quiet. Shh, puppies. No, they're just gonna keep playing. So, all right, so we're gonna talk about the Being Indigenous book again, and we're gonna talk about particularly, let me see. I realized in the last one I did not give credit to the author. So let me do that here. If I can find it. It is going to be in part 3 on perspectives of colonialization and identity. And it's going to be topic number 8. It's going to be called Of This Red Earth by Henrietta Mann. All right. And this particular piece, I think, is a really good look at history a little bit from an Indigenous perspective, but also talk about particularly how these things impacted Indigenous persons today. Again, the term even American Indian, and it's one that I don't use for a number of reasons, really describes essentially the citizens of all the First Nations. And First Nations is really just a term that is used within Indigenous cultures that talks about the fact that essentially they were the first people here, they were the first nation, and that it's important to recognize that. And by calling them American Indian, this term in and of itself was a term used throughout history to describe people through European lens that were not European. And it's something that specifically lays claim to these persons in a way that is denotes the harms of which colonialization has used genocidal and cultural genocidal practices in order to homogenize an entire plethora of First Nations, of groups of people. And so isolating them into one homogenous group of American Indian, discredits the wide amount of cultural variation, and also creates ownership of those individuals in a way that is both inappropriate and continues to perpetuate colonialistic ideologies. This is, again, encouraged and legitimized through the colonialistic processes, right? When you have a nation that is primarily European and white, then the actions of European and white individuals to obtain such land tends to be legitimized in a way that doesn't count for the massive amount of harm, of death, of rape, of trauma that has been left behind and is continued within its parameters, right? As considering the colonialists won, those colonialistic practices are present throughout the way that society operates. And one of those is through language and through the speaking of Indigenous people as American Indians, because they are not claimed, they are not American, right? They are Indigenous people who were here long before America was, or America was even thought of, and long before Europeans were. The author talks about the 4 periods of time of the Cheyenne, and specifically there is the ancient time, which essentially denotes a way in which their culture was attacked, essentially was annihilated in a lot of ways. There's the times of the dogs, when there was domestication processes, there were processes in which to create new economic structures. There's the time of the buffalo, in which essentially was the time of reconstruction or removing of Indigenous persons, and then the time of the horse, which we'll get into. So colonialization, again, assimilation schools, New Deals, these are all things that we talked about within the history of the United States lesson. And I am going to refer you back to those for the majority of those processes and those more in-depth look at those. And again, the reason I am giving you these multiple pieces that continue to talk about these historic moments is so that these historic moments get put in your brain in the same way that the historic moments from the colonialistic lens get put in your brain. I want to make sure that we're talking about these moments more than once so that it's not one source that does it. It's showing you over and over and over again. These are the parts of history that are intentionally not taught in our public education system because our public education system comes specifically through a European Eurocentric lens. They talked about a couple more. I'm going to get into those. A policy of termination, which is just the termination of rights as citizens, termination of rights as Indigenous persons with their own citizenship. And this came at a very state level, but it was a federal level, but the federal kind of fell through in ways. But the state level was able to kind of isolate and ignore Indigenous persons through legal parameters. The policy of self-determination, so that ability to essentially govern themselves, be able to have policies that trump or like go over the United States government, didn't work as planned. It created essentially social studies and things of that nature that talked about, like, say, the education system in Indigenous places and how it was a poor education. And so many policies were created and creations of the Office of Indigenous Education. So essentially what happened was, here, we're going to give you this opportunity to govern yourself so that you can prove that, so that essentially I can have data that proves that you need me so that I can make policies to run over you. And that's essentially what happened. But what also is part of this is the creation of specific governmental roles that govern parts of Indigenous culture and the way in which Indigenous cultures were set and told that they have poor education system if they're not the same as the Eurocentric education system, right? So all of the measures for success were based on essentially European colonialistic assimilation, as opposed to how are you describing your education system, while also denying any of the resources that you might be able to acquire outside of certain specific ones that we might let you have. So here, you're going to be scarce on resources. You're going to be scarce on economic funds, but we want you to create this particular brand of education system in this particular way that matches the Eurocentric education system that may or may not, does not have any kind of relevance to your cultural practices. And then when you don't achieve these things that we want you to achieve, we're going to then create governmental roles from our government that will then control and run the way you should operate in your culture. So as we look at that, right, we can break that down in a number of ways, but essentially what it's saying is our measures of control are based on you assimilating to us. And if you don't do that, then we're going to essentially take control and make that happen, which is just yet another way in which it's creating a cycle of colonialistic practices that take away autonomy from Indigenous cultures. There was some success when it came to child welfare and religion and the ability to practice religion in 1978. Now, there was a Supreme Court ruling that tribal authority on all things related to child adoption and placement, and that specifically came down to the ability for Indigenous children to be able to practice Indigenous religion. Now, again, this has been stomped on and stepped on and done a number of things. However, when it comes to specific tribes, the recognized ones, which again is a whole nother problem in and of itself, Indigenous people don't all fit into the tribes that are recognized by the United States government. And if they are not recognized, then these laws in particular do not apply to them. And so the ability for a tribe to have authority on all things related to the kids and where they might be or who can adopt them or et cetera, or what kind of schooling, et cetera, that they may do while in the child welfare system, really boils down to whether or not that person can be proven to be part of the tribe and can be proven to that tribe is a recognizable tribe. So that in and of itself has its own obstacles. In 1978, there was also the American Indian Religious Freedom Act that essentially denotes that Indigenous persons are free to practice their religion as they see fit. However, there's infringements all over this, including the demolishing and or ecological disasters surrounding Indigenous lands and sacred places, the control over peyote as a substance, and the infringements that happen based on the United States government or governmental practices like policing, etc. The infringements that happen to the American Indian Religious Freedom Act. So anytime the government does something that doesn't allow them religious freedom, none of those things are prosecuted, and none of those things, in the rare attempts that they are, don't win because they're processed within a United States government organization who's going to side generally with the United States. We saw this over and over and over again when it came to the pipeline. And we continue to see it, and we will continue to see it as we continue to sell off, lessen Indigenous lands, and continue to claim ownership essentially of Indigenous practice and what happens on these lands. In 1988, Supreme Court ruled that the Forest Service could work on Indigenous lands, which again is just this another way in which it is infringing on the Indigenous Religious Freedom Act. So overall, really, I wanted you guys to see this and talk about the fact that again, they still have strength and resilience and religion or resilience within these practices. They still talk about how on this earth there is there is a way in which, because of the positionality that they hold, they're going to continue to be strong, and that strength is what's going to build their resilience, despite all of these obstacles that the U.S. and Canadian government put in their way. And something that, again, I want to mention as we work through this particular text, one of the reasons that I chose it is because that although it talks about history and all of the trauma and all of the negative things, almost always is there a narrative of resilience within the pieces. And that is something that, as a culture, writing about your own culture, being able to position yourself to have resilience as opposed to somebody writing about you and all the trauma that is done to you, gives a level of autonomy back about your own history. And that's something that I think is incredibly important in academic spaces, to give autonomy back to and give a voice back to those who have been made invisible for such an extended period of time. So if you have any questions about this piece or any of the other pieces, please let me know. We've got one more lecture, and that's on the chapter in Brown Enough. And I think that that piece itself and that book is more of an individualized look at some of these bigger problems that we talk about, but it gives examples and really talks about the ways in which these create a reality, create a lived experience for people of color. So please do not hesitate to ask questions. I know, yet again, I want to emphasize that this is a white female talking about the words and generational trauma and harm that has come to Indigenous persons. And so I want to yet again recognize that I am sitting in a positionality that can turn this off when I turn off the computer screen, as opposed to those who live it. And so it's important to, again, recognize my own positionality as I sit here and consistently lecture to you guys about race and discrimination that is and continues to happen in the United States when it comes to race and ethnicity. So I hope you guys have a great rest of your week, and I will be back soon.